Greetings and welcome to today's hour-long painting lesson. Before we begin, I'd quickly like to show you all of the materials we'll be using here today, starting with this 7.5 by 9-inch canvas board. You're more than welcome to use a real canvas or something much larger or much smaller. Just be aware that the larger it is, the more detail you can incorporate, but the longer it will take to do so. From there, let's talk about our paints, starting with a titanium white, a Mars black, primary blue, red, and yellow. These two mix to make an orange, these two mix to make a green, these two mix to make a purple. So you essentially have all of your colors mixable with those three. It's a very cost-effective way of doing your paintings. Then we also have a little burnt umber here. This is just to get to brown a little bit quicker. Should be noted that all of these are the Liquitex Basics brand. Now I'm using a glass palette to put them all on. As you can see, you don't have to use a glass palette. You can use a plastic palette or a wooden palette. Just ensure that you're using something that doesn't allow the paint to sink in. You want it to sit on the top, that way it doesn't dry faster and it doesn't kind of get away from you. On that note, I'm going to be using a couple of brushes here. These three are square-headed brushes. I have a large, medium, and small. This is for blocking in large areas, this is for detail work, and this is for everything in between. Then I have two small, round-headed brushes. They are for feathered edges, rendering much more softer aesthetic pieces. We'll talk about which subjects we want to include these in the actual painting. But then I'm using one more brush, and it is the old square-headed brush. Now, I use this in all of my 10-minute lessons, essentially, but if you don't have one of these, what it is essentially a brush where the bristles kind of leaf off in varying directions. So when you make a dabbing motion, you render a litany of implications. If you don't have one of these, you can make one very simply by taking a regular square or flat-headed brush, peeling back the bristles, applying pressure, or applying it to a hard surface, allowing the bristles to expand, and then applying pressure, moving it about. Then you will quickly have something fairly similar to this. We'll be using water to clean off all of our brushes and to thin our paints so that we can get them to get more of a life and more of a transparent aesthetic. We'll be using a paper towel or a cloth to wipe off our brushes, ensure that they are clean after each use and that we can use them again. Finally, I have two more items. That is a Crayola pencil crayon, or a colored pencil, I believe you say in the United States. But this is for drawing on our initial image. This is a fine-tipped Sharpie, and I'm using it to highlight the pieces in the foreground that I want to see through thin layers of paint. So this is for the basic sketch, right? This is for highlighting things that you want to see later on, so that you can paint over them and still kind of see them a little bit. It won't be totally visible through the entirety of the painting once you apply a certain amount of paint. You won't be able to see this through the paint anymore, but it does help you later on. So with that being said, let's jump into our 1 hour painting. Greetings and welcome. We're going to begin here with our large square-headed brush. I'm going to ensure that it is damp. That way we can thin our paints a little bit, extend their wet life, and drag them out slightly farther. Then I'm taking some pure titanium white paint, and I'm beginning to apply it directly to our sky. I'm not using a mixture here because I wanted to show you that you don't always have to blend on the palette. Sometimes you can blend on the canvas, and the sky is a great place to practice that because it's innately fairly void of detail. Once the entirety of the sky is fully covered in titanium white, I'm taking some pure primary blue, applying it to the top of our sky, and then blending it down with a litany of horizontal strokes. I'm using a very soft touch to avoid a streaky aesthetic, and the intent here is to ensure that the top of the sky has more of a blue and the bottom of the sky has more of a white. I'm trying to create a very slight, very subtle gradient. I'm ensuring that the sky is very bright and washed out because I want the background to be very bright. and illuminating. I didn't want a darker sky in this painting, and that's why we led with a good amount of titanium white and then added a small amount of primary blue right after that. Now I'm grabbing my old square-headed brush. I'm taking a mixture of primary yellow, primary blue, and soon titanium white. It's worth noting that primary blue is a lot stronger of a pigment than primary yellow, so if you want a fairly even mixture, you'll probably need to use more yellow than blue. Then, with that old square-headed brush in a tapping motion, I'm beginning to imply a litany of trees in the background. And these trees are very bright because they're being washed out by the light in the sky. It's also worth noting that the sky is still fairly wet, so as I move upwards with this tapping motion, as I get more into the sky, the pigments begin to blend a little bit, which is actually a great thing, because it looks like the trees are getting lost in the light and in the reflective colors of the sky. The blues from the sky will reflect down and around and onto the trees in the far distance. So generally, when you're doing a painting with a blue sky, the background should have a lot more blue blended in with it. And by having it still wet, we're doing that very easily. Now here I'm using a bit of a more desaturated green, and I just threw a very, very minute amount of black into it. And I'm doing this because we generally want our backgrounds to be much more desaturated. We want to save our heavy saturated pigments for the foreground, because that's just how the eye optically sees things, generally speaking. So here I'm just going over all of those saturated colors I just incorporated and kind of dulling them down just a little bit. Here you can see that I'm wetting my brush, ensuring that it is fairly clean, but then I'm drying it off. And that's really important with this brush, because when it's very wet, the bristles can clump together and you won't render as many implications on the canvas. So this is really the only brush that I would implore you to use while it's fairly dry. The rest of them I do like to keep consistently damp. From there, I'm taking a titanium white, and you can use a mixture of a very, very bright desaturated green, but I'm applying this to the tops of the trees, and then I'm blending down, not in the conventional stroke motion, but in the tapping motion. We're trying to get the implication that the tops of these trees are much brighter, that they are absorbing much more light, that much more light is passing through them. And it's a very delicate thing. You don't want the bottom of the trees to be too dark. You don't want the tops of the trees to be too light. You want them to be very close, but slightly brighter and slightly darker. Again, we save our starker values and our more saturated colors for the foreground. We want the background to be a little bit washed out, and it'll help us keep the attention in the foreground. So here I'm taking a slightly darker, very, very minorly darker green. It has a little bit more of our Mars black. I'm applying it to the bottom of the trees, and then I'm blending upwards. So we have the white at the top blended down, and we have the black at the bottom blended up. But the white isn't a pure white, the black isn't a pure black, they are all still very muted. The goal isn't to render something that's incredibly bright and incredibly dark, but the goal is to render something that's incredibly muted, incredibly similar, but with slight differences. We'll get into the heavy contrasts again in the foreground. That's something you'll hear me say 100 times in this painting, but it's just because it's so important, and if I explain it poorly the first time, hopefully I get it right the 38th time. And I know I'm someone who learns a lot better through repetition, so I'm trying to deliver that to you as well. Now here you can see that I'm beginning to render a bit of a darker green. It's still desaturated. I'm using a mixture of my white and my black to desaturate it, and I'm beginning to apply this more in the middle ground of our painting, this time rendering a bush and some foliage here in the middle ground. Now, as we move forward in the painting, as we get closer to where we are, you want to incorporate more saturation. You want to darken things slightly, and that means using less black and less white. However, black and white are still necessary to some extent because you do want to brighten and darken these pigments, right? So it's about finding that balance. You don't want to use a pure black in the middle ground. You don't want to use a pure white in the middle ground. You're using a range in between. And this can be a little bit frustrating initially, but you will get it. And once you do, it'll just be absolutely wonderful because depth will just make so much sense. You'll be able to incorporate it in all of your work and your paintings, and it'll just come very innately. Now here, as you can see, I'm rendering these bushes. I'm applying a slightly darker underlayer, a slightly darker foundation. Then I'm mixing a brighter pigment, and I'm applying this highlight to the tops of our bushes, as you can see. Again, the highlight isn't a pure white, and it's actually far from it. It's a very similar color to what we just mixed, but it's a little bit brighter. It's got a little bit more yellow in it. And I'm only applying it to the tops of these bushes. And that's important because the tops of the bushes are going to be absorbing much more light. Much more light can pass through them, much more reflected light can work around them. So they're going to be fairly bright, whereas the bottom of the bushes are going to be darker because the tops are casting shadows on them. They're much more dense, so less light can get through them, and much more reflective light can also find its way around them. So that's also very important. But again, we don't want a harsh contrast. We want it to be a slightly higher contrast than what we have in the very background, and as we move forward in the painting, that contrast will just get heightened and heightened. So that's really what we're doing right now. It's also worth noting that you want to separate a lot of these bushes. So you don't want them to be the same size, you don't want them to be the same shape, and you're essentially creating the difference in between them with those highlights. So it's almost like drawing an outline around them, but we're doing it with a tapping motion, and we're doing it with a slightly better, brighter green. So it's just about going back and forth in that process. Here we're getting a little bit closer in the foreground to us, the viewer, and so I'm beginning to implement slightly darker greens, as you can see. And we're going to continue this process. So while we create a gradient in the sky from that blue at the top to the white at the bottom, and very subtle versions of each obviously, we're doing the same thing with our greens and our contrast. In the back it's very gray, it's very washed out, and then as we slowly move forward in the painting, it gets more saturated and it gets more harsh. And that's really what's going to implement depth in your painting here. Now there you could see that I was just adding in a couple of additional highlights, and I'm being pretty risky here with continuously grabbing more water and not really cleaning off my brush well, because again, if your square-headed brush is very wet, then it kind of clumps together. So just be careful with that. If you find that you're not rendering all of the implied marks that you'd like to with it, dry it off really, really well, then apply paint directly to it, then apply it directly to the canvas. Don't add water. And I know this sounds crazy because I'm the guy who always says, add water, add water, add water, make your brush damp. This is the only exception. Now here I wanted to show you how you can kind of reverse engineer these bushes. I'm starting off this time with the highlight on the top, and then I'm going to go into a darker pigment, apply it to the bottom, and blend it upwards. And this isn't my preferred method of doing this, but I think it's important to show you that there are multiple ways of getting things done, and we all have our own preferences. So this is another way of doing it. Again, you can see the highlights at the top of the bush. I'm applying the darker pigment to the bottom of the bush, and then they blend together. Again, not my favorite way of doing this, but a way of doing it for sure. You can also see that I'm scraping the brush on the canvas there, and I'm not doing a dabbing motion in the areas that I'm fine with being a little bit flat, right? So generally, for the most part, when you're using this brush, use a tapping motion, as you can see. But occasionally, if you just need to put in a dark layer to let it dry, to apply a highlight on top, sometimes you can drag it and you can still use that function of the brush that you kind of lost when you turned it into an old square-headed brush, or rather thought you lost, because you can still do it. But here, as you can see, we're just getting darker and darker as we move into the foreground. Then I'm going to clean off my brush fairly well. I'm actually going to let this dry before I begin my next step, and we are far from finished with these bushes, with this foliage, but we'll get there soon. Now we are going to take our medium-sized square-headed brush, get it damp, not wet, but damp. Then I'm going to grab some burnt umber, some titanium white, and I'll even grab a bit of Mars black. The goal here is to render a very subtle, very washed out, very desaturated brown. And that's exactly what we're doing here. I'm taking a little bit of additional white, ensuring that it's a very neutral tone. It isn't very dark, it isn't very light, it's very much in the middle. Then I'm beginning to render rocks predominantly on the sides of where our water will be falling. However, we will be implementing a couple of them in the middle as well. I'm using a square-headed brush here to render these because the square-headed brush innately has very sharp edges, and we require these sharp edges to render sharp edges. So if you're ever working on a subject that has a very hard, strict edge, use a square-headed brush. It's a very efficient way of doing this. Round-headed brushes, liner brushes, they innately generally have a round, a feathered edge. So the tip of them is very sharp, but then if you go slightly to the right, left, top, or bottom, it kind of blends out. And this is something that's fantastic for rendering things like clouds, or things with more of a softer aesthetic. Whereas here, we do need that hard edge. We need it to be sharp. The square-headed brush also can hold a lot more paint than a round-headed brush or a liner brush. So that's also important to remember as well. Now here, as you can see, all of my rocks are slightly different from one another. They're changing, they're evolving, some are larger, some are smaller, and some even connect. As you can see, that one in the middle kind of branches out into the far left of the waterway. So you want to ensure that much like your trees, much like your mountains, much like your clouds, your rocks here are always evolving. As we move closer to the foreground, as we mentioned before, we're using more of a burnt umber because it's going to be much more saturated. And that's the goal, to ensure that the foreground is less washed out in pigment than the background. So we're slowly incorporating more and more of that burnt umber. However, we're still using the titanium white. We're still using the Mars black because we don't want it to be like a light switch on and off. We want a gradient moving from the back to the foreground. And it's a little bit more difficult because these subjects aren't all connected, right? But it's a great practice to get into, and it's something that will be really important in painting later on. So this is actually a great lesson to practice that sort of thing if you find that you're having issues with it. So here we are moving forward, and it's also worth noting that the rocks and the ground in the foreground are probably going to be a lot larger than those in the background. Not because in reality they're a lot larger, but because of perspective. As things move farther and farther away in the painting, they get more desaturated normally, and they get smaller and smaller. The trees in the foreground will look big, will look very full, whereas the trees in the far, far background, they're much more small, they're implied, right? So the same goes for our rocks here. So there isn't also much of a depth and distance between the start of our rocks and the end of the rocks, so it won't be a large contrast between the two, but it still will be there to an extent, and I still would implore you to think about that when you're rendering any and all subjects within your painting. So from there, I'm going to begin to add in the base layer for our ground. And it's worth noting that nothing in the painting is done. This is something that I state in most of my paintings because I wholly believe that almost everything in a painting should be finished at the same time. We'll go back and we'll add highlights to the rocks. We'll go back and we'll add more highlights to the bushes. We'll reshape them. We'll add foliage. We'll do a lot. Right now, we're just building the foundation. We're building the bottom and the bare bones of it. This is an analogy I use all the time, but if you think about a house, the base of the house, the foundation, the cement area, it's not that aesthetically pleasing, but it's entirely necessary to build something very pretty on top. That's what we're doing right now with the very flat, very dark, very desaturated pigments. We'll be adding the highlights on top. We'll be adding that house on top of that foundation. But you have to be patient. You have to have faith in the fact that you can do this. You can't get discouraged. And you just you have to trust the system. And once you get it, you get it. And you never have to question, is this looking right again? So you really just need to do one painting, understand it, get why it's happening, and then you can incorporate that mindset and that understanding into all of your paintings going forward. Here I'm adding a slight bit of a highlight to our ground. As you can see, I'm using the square-headed brush. I'm doing a bit of a tapping motion, and I'm just trying to create little mounds of dirt that are above. If you find that you add too much light, then you can get a slightly darker color or the color that you initially used and begin to apply that as well. It's generally best to apply this as the bottom layer is almost dry or entirely dry, otherwise they can blend together a little bit too much. But it's also worth noting that each little mound, the top of it should be fairly sharp, or the bottom of it can be a little bit more blended down into the earth, into the ground. Because the top part, the highlighted part, it's protruding, it is up higher, and it's absorbing more light, where the bottom portion of each little mound, it's getting a little bit of a shadow cast upon it. So if you think about this, if you think about the bushes, if you think about the trees, if you think about all of it, it all follows the same rules, right? The top of things get more light. The bottom portion of things generally get a little bit more of a shadow. They don't get as much reflected light. Where it gets a little bit tricky is understanding how much light, how much of a contrast do you incorporate. And that's generally solved by how far away it is in the painting or how close it is in the painting. Because again, if it's far away in the painting, it's very washed out. The colors blend a lot more together. You won't have a stark contrast. Whereas in the foreground, you will. So from there, I haven't said with that being said in a while. With that being said, I'm now going to begin working some pure Mars black in between our rocks. And I'm still using that square-headed brush because I want to be able to use fine lines and work around these rocks which I just rendered. And I'm doing this because I want to create a dark underlayer for our water. I'm only going to do this to the base of our little stream waterfall-like thing. And I'm doing this because acrylic paints are semi-transparent. So when I apply a lighter color on top of this black, you'll still be able to see through it a little bit. Even if the black is fully dry, you will see it. It will darken the pigment that we apply on top of it, which is good because I don't want the water on here to innately be that bright. I want the water at the base to be a lot brighter. It'll have a lot more reflected light and it'll just make a lot more sense. We also needed to do this so that it looked like there was also darker rock underneath, right? All of the rock that we just did is protruding. It's higher up. This rock is darker because it's under the water and it's not getting as much light. So it's very much like the rock that we just did. You can even blend the bottom of your rocks into this if you want. It isn't necessary, but you can do it. So there, I'm just kind of working my way around these rocks here. You have an opportunity to rework them if you want because you're kind of working reductively on top of them. And if you find that your pigments are a little bit too thin, if you find that the black is a little bit too transparent, just use less water. However, if you find that the black isn't going on cleanly, if you can't get the sharp edges around your rocks, then I would implore you to use more water. Water will thin your paint, but it will also make it so it's more exact. So you don't get a toothy aesthetic, so you don't get a rough canvasly aesthetic texture and all of that. So it's all about finding the balance in between those two. And I'm going to let that dry. So again, just to reiterate, the rocks, they're not done. They need highlights. The bushes, they're not done. They need highlights. The ground, not done, needs highlights. All of it. So again, and I'm saying this again because it's easy to go to that negative place in your head, don't get discouraged. It needs to look like this to look great very soon. This is only an hour-long painting lesson. It will very soon look good. You just have to trust the process. But with that being said, I think that's the third time we've said that. I'm trying to say it more because I think it's funny at this point. I don't know if you noticed, but in the 10-minute painting lessons, one time I said it like 4 times, and then you guys, you noticed, you mentioned it. And I was like, well, this could be a fun game. How many times can I get it in? I think in the pink cherry blossom tree lesson, I was able to say it like 13 times. And the people who aren't very aware of the channel were like, what are you doing? But I think a lot of you thought it was funny. So it's something we'll continue to do and work on. But from there, what I'm doing is I'm adding in these trees. Also, to take a step back, I just had the image on the screen of the painting in the end, and that's again just to reassure you, to show you that the painting does end up looking good, and you can trust me. But moving on from there, I'm beginning to implement trees. I'm beginning with the base, and then as we move up the trees, they get larger, or no, they don't. They get smaller. I'm sorry, I got off track with my little "with that being said" rant thing, and I was being a little too loquacious, and now we're behind, and now I'm fumbling over my words, but we'll get back on track and we'll deliver you the best lesson possible. So the trees, again, at the bottom, larger. As we move up, they get smaller. It's also worth noting that the trees are all leaning in different directions. None of them are really going straight up. That's very important. Also, the edges aren't perfect. They're not straight. They're full of bumps and curves and strange little intricacies. This is what makes them interesting. This is what makes them unique. And this is something I would implore you heavily to incorporate in your trees. Also worth noting, I think I'm saying also worth noting more than I'm saying with that being said. We might need to change that. But I'm trying to ensure that my trees are different widths from the ones next to them, that they connect to other trees at the base or wherever they will in different ways from the ones next to them. Much like our rocks, much like our bushes, much like everything else in all of our paintings, we need to ensure that we don't do the same thing twice. There are always little intricate pieces that are moving, that are changing. I'm beginning with these by blocking in the edges, and then I kind of fill them in. It's kind of just like coloring. But again, if you are finding that you're having an issue with rendering a very sharp edge for your tree, again, I would implore you to use a square-headed brush, and I would implore you to use a little bit more water in your mixture. If you find that the initial application is a little bit too thin because of the water, you can always go back in and add a second or third application on top of it. But we're essentially just building this up, as you can see here. I did switch to the smaller square-headed brush because we do need to work on some much more fine lines and areas, and this brush is exactly what we need to do that. So we've now used all 3 of our square-headed brushes. That's really all I think you need to render sharp objects, and as you can see, they all have their uses. Now we're going to take some primary yellow, some primary blue, mix them together, grab a little bit of titanium white, and I'm just going to refill in the trees that we have in the background that I kind of missed initially. I thought we might put a tree in front, we didn't. And the application here, doing the strokes, is going to be different than the tapping application. So it won't look perfect, it'll look a little bit different. But if you wanted to ensure that it did look a little bit better, you could do this on a tapping motion with this smaller square-headed brush. But I think we'll be covering a lot of it with foliage, so I'm not too concerned. That's also something that's great about forests. If you don't like an area, you can cover it with leaves later on. So now that we've let our rocks dry, both the protruding brown ones and the darker black underlayer of rocks, we can begin to apply some water on top of it. We're going to begin here with our medium-sized square-headed brush. It is damp. I'm grabbing a good amount of primary blue and titanium white, and I'm grabbing a very small amount of primary yellow and Mars black. The Mars Black is to ensure that it is a little bit desaturated because we will be applying it in the background, and the yellow is to give it a little bit of a green tint. The water for the most part is a blue because it is reflecting from the sky, but there's also that green in there because there's so much green foliage surrounding it. It will have an impact on the reflective color of the water, and it's important to incorporate at least a minute amount of that. I'm applying it with my square-headed brush because we need to work around our sharp rocks, and the best way to do that is with a sharp brush. So we're just beginning to apply all of this blue on top of the black portion of rock that we initially applied. Now, I'm applying this water in the same way that I feel it will be falling. So within this area of rock, within this little waterfall, there are flat plains, and then there are plains that kind of fall, and then they land on other flat plains, which then fall into other flat lanes. It's very much like very abstract stairs, right? And that's kind of how you need to think about it. The areas that are going to be fairly flat, you want to do in horizontal strokes, and the falling areas I'm doing predominantly in more of a vertical stroke. But they're not perfect stairs, so I'm occasionally moving my vertical strokes slightly more to the right, slightly more to the left. I'm just following the general idea of how I think these rocks are going to be formed underneath, and I'm ensuring that it's always changing and evolving. Now, I need more paint, and I wanted to show you how we could try to remix the same color. So I have my initial mixture there to the right, and now I'm making a second mixture here to the left. I want it to be the same. So I'm initially creating it from memory, but I have that reference right beside, which is wildly helpful. So I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, does it need more green? Does it need more blue? Does it need to be a little bit brighter? And once I have something I think I like, I'm going to apply it to my canvas. Now I realize it's a little bit too dark, so I add a little bit of titanium white to it. But the titanium white desaturated it, so I added a little bit of additional blue into it. And that rendered me the color that I actually really wanted. So it's very much a process of trial and error. It's asking yourself, is this pigment too saturated or too muted? If it's too saturated, add some black or white. If it's too muted, add some primary color. Ask yourself if it's too dark or if it's too bright. And it's very much just asking yourself those 3 or 4 questions over and over until you mix and figure out the pigment that you really want to render. So that's essentially what we did. It's also worth noting that because we're applying this blue on top of a white instead of a black, it will be a little bit brighter and more saturated, which is what I wanted because it is in the foreground. Now I do want to blend this blue over portions of our land, so I just added a lot of water to my brush and now I'm blending the blue on top of it. This is going to make it look like the water is transparent. You can see the land descending into the water or the water coming up onto the land. And it's achieved with a very, very watery mixture. You don't want to use thick pigment, otherwise it won't be as transparent, and the water will make it much more transparent. So as you can see, we get this very subtle transition from one to the other, and it's a fantastic way to add subtlety, to add depth into your painting, and to show that the water does have a very transparent nature, right? That there is something going on underneath. It makes it much more interesting and less blocky and flat. From there, I'm going to begin applying some detail into our water. I'm doing so with my smaller liner brush, and I'm using a slightly brighter mixture of the blue that we initially used. I'm applying the highlights. So these are areas that are going to be receiving more sunlight, or areas that are kind of splashing upwards. Because when water splashes, it breaks into all of these mini pieces, right? And more light can kind of absorb into them. It's easier to pass through because it isn't as dense. So I'm thinking about areas like the flat plains on top that are going to be receiving more water, and then the areas that are kind of splashing or moving outwards, kind of protruding more so, the areas that aren't as dense. So we're doing a lot of these stair-like slant shapes that are moving horizontally. However, they're slightly slanted. They're moving up and down because, of course, they're not on stairs. They're on varying levels of rock. And then we're also adding highlights that are moving more vertically, but they're kind of moving in these zigzag effects around rocks as well. So those are predominantly the two types of movements of strokes they're going to be using, both horizontal and vertical, but they're kind of squiggly, they slant in different ways, and it's just wherever you feel the water will be protruding and the light will be hitting. So it's a process. It's also worth noting that that initial layer of blue was still wet, so when we're applying this lighter layer on top, it's blending a little bit. So we're not getting that incredibly bright, incredibly vibrant application initially. We're not getting all of that super highlight. We're getting something that's fairly close to the blue, which is actually really, really useful because it's giving us an opportunity to try things, to kind of sketch on where we think these highlights should be. If it isn't exactly what we needed, that's fine, because we can go back and we can add a real highlight later on. We're just building up layers. So you have our fairly muted initial blue, then you have a slightly lighter highlighted blue on top, and then we'll add an even lighter highlighted pigment on top of that. We might do another one. And the more layers you do with this, generally the more real and better the painting will look. And again, it's great because it is a trial run. It is an area for you to practice, for you to learn, and this is something that we don't get to cover in our 10-minute paintings because it is a little bit more complex. So it is something that having that time to learn is a very vital thing. If you find that you're having an issue with this, don't worry about it because, as I always say, remember, acrylic paints are highly, highly malleable. They are a very forgiving medium, and if you mess up, all you have to do is let it dry for 10 minutes, apply your base layer again, and then begin to reapply your highlight layers. So it's a great medium because it dries quickly, because it doesn't create a lot of texture. So when you're just learning, you can try so many different things and you don't have to worry about messing up because you can redo it. It's simple, it's easy. That's also what's great about working on smaller canvases like that, like this. They don't take too long to rework, to cover something up, to go back to. That's generally actually why I like to work on these smaller canvases for these lessons, because I think it's important that you give yourself enough time, but you're not working on something that's too much of a time sink. If you mess up on something, it shouldn't take a day to fix. And again, that's why the smaller canvases here are working very well for that. I'm getting on this little loquacious rant regarding this. I didn't mean to do that. But it's also worth noting that I'm applying these highlights to our water, but I'm using a dirty actual water, right? If you look at my mug over there, it has this green tint to it, which will affect your painting, and I probably should have cleaned my water. So while you're working on this, when you're working on this, I would implore you to keep your water fairly clean when you're working on highlights, especially highlights that are going to involve a good amount of white pigment. But here you can see I'm fairly happy with a good amount of the movements in my water, so I'm beginning to apply real highlights on top. That means more titanium white in my mixture, and because the initial blue has had a good amount of time to dry, I'm getting more of the natural pigment that I have on my palette rather than a mixed pigment. So it's all about layering, it's all about taking our time, it's about not getting frustrated. Again, initially the water looked ugly. It was like there was just black and rock and this really muted blue, but through time we built the foundation and then we built the house on top. And that's an analogy that I guess I've said twice now in this video, but you know what, I might just say it again because it is a good analogy, and it's so easy to get discouraged when painting, when you're creating anything really. And it's important to recognize that, you know what, it's okay. It's okay. Sometimes you need to go through these processes. They teach you a lot. And of course, it's important to just enjoy the process, right? Painting is meant to be a relaxing thing. It's meant to be a cathartic process. It's not something you should worry about. It's not something you should dread. It's something that you should say, oh, well, if I mess up, I mess up and then I try again and I learn something and then my next 10 paintings are better for it. That's something a lot of people don't realize about mistakes. They teach you things. And that means if you make 10 mistakes in a painting, you now know 10 new things for your next painting. That painting will be wildly better because of it. So mistakes, especially in painting, not necessarily a bad thing at all. So don't worry about them. If they come, embrace them, learn from them, and move forward from there. Here we're using a more titanium white, a brighter pigment, and just building it up. I'm not using it as much in the background because, again, I do want that area still be a little bit more muted, and I don't want it to have too many, I don't want it to compete with the foreground too much, right? That's generally why we desaturated things, because A, the background, that's optically how it works in real life, but also because we want the attention to be on the foreground. We don't want all of these competing pieces in the painting, and that's generally an easy way to do it, through saturation and through value. And saturation and value are really what dictate depth in a painting, color, lighting, really everything. So if you can get saturation and value down, then you know it all. You can really do whatever you want. So, and I know that can be a little bit complicated at first. I know a lot of people struggle with that. But if you have some extra time and you're kind of confused about it, just Google value in painting. Just Google saturation in painting. See how they work together. Even read the Wikipedia pages, right? I talk about it a lot in my book, but you don't need to buy my book to learn these things. You can find it on the internet as well. So from there, we're going to move on to the next step, which is highlights on our rocks and on our ground. For this, I'm using my smaller square-headed brush because I do want to apply this to rock, which is sharp, and the square-headed brush, again, is sharp. I'm using a mixture of burnt umber, which is what we initially used for the rock, a bit of titanium white to brighten it up to be a highlight, and a little bit of a yellow to warm it up as well. However, it isn't yellow dominant, and that's important. I'm only really applying the highlights to our rocks in the areas that are going to be receiving a lot of sunlight, which is also important. It works very much in the same way that we talked about our bushes, right? The tops of them receiving a lot of light. The bottom portions aren't receiving as much light and they're having shadows cast upon them. So you only really want to apply these highlights to those top areas that are going to be receiving sunlight. If it's in a very shady area, if there are a lot of trees, then that highlight is going to be much more muted. And it follows the same rules just like everything else. Again, painting, while there may be a myriad and a litany of different subjects and things to incorporate in a painting, they all follow the same rules. They all react to light the same way. They all follow the same rules of value and saturation. So it's just about getting these few little techniques perfect in your head and then implementing them into the just plethora of different subjects in your painting. So from there, I'm also going to begin adding a little bit of these highlights into our ground over here as well, into the mounds of dirt. Much like the rocks and much like the bushes, these areas are going to have a brighter top and a darker bottom. The yellow is also great because it's close to the green and it's a warm color. So you get that warm daylight feel, and you also get something that works very cohesively with the colors that surround it. That's something that's also really important to note. I like to start paintings generally with very cohesive colors, and then you can kind of explore outwards from there. But at this point, everything blue moves into green, and green moves into yellow. It's not like we've thrown in a strange purple or a harsh red at this point. It's all very easy on the eyes. If you were to use a complementary color like a red is to green, it would really pop out and it would stand out, and it could be a little bit distracting. This is generally what you want to incorporate in your main subject, but I'd implore you to do that more towards the end of the painting process rather than the start of the painting process. Start with something that all fits together and then add in these slight little details that are meant to pop. So here, it's amazing how far we've gone with only using a couple colors, right? We've used titanium white, we've used Mars black, burnt umber, primary yellow, and primary blue. And that's it. And we've already got a great base, a great foundation to a painting that I know I really like, and I hope you do as well. So it's just about building up that process, slowly getting into our more saturated and harsh colors. Here you can see I'm taking some white and I'm beginning to apply some additional highlights down into the water area. I'm moving in these kind of zigzagged effects, but I'm trying to keep my application fairly sharp, as you can see here. The buildup of highlights in the water will be done in the same way that they were in the falling water. We apply a little bit, it probably blends, it probably gets a little bit darker, and then if we like that line, if we like that area, we go over it again with more of a highlight and we just kind of build it up. But we don't have to do that through all of the initial pieces, because having that subtle difference where some are more highlighted than others will really aid the painting and make it look much more interesting as well. It's important that you don't highlight everything with the same exact value, with the same exact saturated color. You want a little bit of difference, just like you do with shape in rocks, in trees, in mountains, in clouds, etc. So diversity, I always say this, diversity is key when you're painting, not just in shape, not just in color, but also in highlights, in dark areas, and with all of that. Again, it's about diversity. And that's actually great, because generally when we quote unquote mess up, we get these things slightly different or off, right? But that's a good thing, because there needs to be difference. There needs to be areas that are off. You want it to all look cohesive, so you use similar colors and you ensure that your values are correct and all of that. But you do want slight differences. You do want things to change and evolve as they should. So it's worth noting that if you want this water to look a little bit faster, like it's a little more rapidy or it's moving much more quickly, make the highlights more stark. If you want it to look much more soft, if you want it to look much more calm, then use less of these lines and use less of the highlights in the open body of water. You do need the highlights and you do need the movement in the falling water, but in this open pool area here at the bottom, again, if you want it to be calm, use less and less of that. Now, I'm not sure if you can hear him, but my little guy, my cat, he's interjecting here, which is great because he seems to be a frequent member here in the hour-long painting lessons, and I'm happy to have the friend around to discuss this with me. So from there, I'm going to grab more of my brown highlights, as you can see there, and begin to rework some additional details into our ground area. I felt like it was a little bit too desaturated, so here I'm using a bit more of a burnt umber heavy mixture and building that in there as well. It's important that, again, we're always reassessing things. When we apply the paint, when we quote-unquote finish an area, we haven't really finished it. We need to look at it in the context of the larger painting. Does the value, does the saturation, does the color match the trees? Does it match the thing that's adjacent to it? Does it, does it fit in? And sometimes that answer isn't clear until we're done the last piece of the painting, which again is why I say we finish the painting at the same time, all of it. So it's just one of those things. Always be willing to go back and change something if you need to. But from there, I'm going to begin adding some highlights to the edges of our trees. I'm using a mixture of titanium white and burnt umber. I'm using a tapping motion with my smaller square-headed brush, and I'm creating all of these little pieces of bark, as you can see. I'm essentially really highlighting the edge of the tree that will be closest to the light. In this painting, the light is coming from the background, so the back of the tree should be darker while the sides of the tree should be a little bit brighter, one of which more dominant than the other. So much like the water, with the first application, it'll probably blend a little bit, it'll probably be a little bit more transparent, a little bit darker, so we go back and we add on yet again. We build up our layers, and it's great because it builds up so much more depth in that process. If you only had a dark color and a highlight, look a little bit boring, look a little bit flat. But by having to build up these layers as we have a really light tone, and then a light tone, and then a medium to light tone, a medium tone, medium dark, dark, etc. And the more difference in value that you can create like that in the foreground, the better it will look, the more real it will look. But again, in the background, you want it to be much more subtle. You want less of those transitions because you don't want it to be distracting, and you want it to be a little bit more washed out. You want it to have a little bit more of that Gaussian blur-like effect. So these things all fit into the painting at different levels in different areas, and it's one of those things where once you get it, and you get it for all of your paintings, which is fantastic. It does take some time, so don't worry about it if you don't get it all immediately now. It took me a really long time to kind of get all of these rules right. And I still kind of, mess up occasionally, if we're being honest. And I think that's important to recognize too. But again, art is highly subjective. Innately, it cannot be objectively measured, which means it cannot be right or wrong, cannot be good or bad. It's exactly what you want it to be. If you want a piece of bark to be a hot red, then it's a hot red, and that's what it is. That's not wrong, that's what you wanted, that's great. So that's also important to recognize in the painting process as well. I'll tell you how to do things more easily, but you can change that. You can differ from that. You don't have to do exactly what I'm saying. Just because I'm saying it doesn't mean it is 100% correct. Yes, I studied art in university, but something they taught us very predominantly was that, again, art is a subjective medium, which means that it is always changing, and it's different to different people, right? So just keep that in the back of your head as well. Here I'm adding some additional highlights into our bushes, as you can see, and I needed to go back and do this because portions of our rock overlapped it, and I needed these bushes to be on top of the rock for the most part. I'm also applying it to underneath a lot of our trees, and I think that's important just to give them a nice pretty base. You could do the root system and all of that. This is generally a little bit easier, and again, it's an hour-long painting, not a 10-hour-long painting. So we find little tricks like that to hide the bottom portions. But again, I don't think it's really hiding, as I think it is a very aesthetic piece. It's kind of like framing the bottom of the tree, right? So there we have it, and as you can see, the highlights really look like they're building as we're getting closer in the painting because we have those darker colors underneath. It's that contrast that really makes it pop. If you did the entirety of the bush in a bright pigment, it wouldn't look like it has depth, right? You need the light and you need the dark to do that. So that's what we're doing there. Now here I'm creating a little bit of a rock here in the foreground. I'm starting with my burnt umber, a little bit of Mars black, a little bit of titanium white. I'm using the medium-sized square-headed brush to ensure that the rock is indeed sharp, and I'm just kind of creating a bit of a vignette effect here in the bottom left and right hand corners of the painting. If you're new to this and you don't know what a vignette is simply a darker area on the outskirts of the painting. You do this because the eye will innately go to the brightest portion in the painting. So if the middle of the painting or an area close to the middle of the painting is the brightest, it will capture the viewer's attention and it will probably stay there. Then I'm going to take my old square-headed brush and create a silhouette of a bush here in the bottom right-hand corner, doing a lot of that tapping motion, creating a lot of implied foliage, and we'll build a lot of highlights on top of it. But here we're almost using a pure black, and now is the time to do that. We've been saving it for our real foreground, and here it will really pay off. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm covering a bit of our rock, just trying to build a little bit more depth. I included the rock because I wanted to incorporate another subject to make it a little bit more interesting. Interjecting rocks in between bushes is generally a very easy way of doing that, and it's just a quick, efficient process and method. Generally, if you incorporate one, you probably want to incorporate a little bit of the other. Now here, as you can see, I'm really cleaning off this brush well because we need to let that dry before we begin to apply our highlights. If we were to apply our highlights to it now, they'd mix with the black, they'd be incredibly muted, and it wouldn't look like it was in the foreground. It might look like it was in the middle ground or background. We need that harsh contrast, and to get that, we need to let that dry. Then I'm going to grab some more additional brown and begin to line our trees as we did initially. As you can see, it's in a tapping motion, it's with a slightly brighter pigment, and it's on the edge of the tree that will be receiving the most light. It's a very repetitive process, but it's an important process. It'll give it a lot of detail, and we're not just outlining the edge of our tree. We are building texture, we are building a pattern, and we're giving it a really nice bark. So you could just move a straight horizontal line down the tree, and it might not look wrong, but it wouldn't look as interesting. In fact, I'd implore you to do that on trees in the far distance, because you won't see the detail in them, right? They'll be a little bit more lost in the background. You get more of that Gaussian blur effect. But as you move towards the foreground, that's when you want to incorporate more bark, as we're doing here. You can really see the bright bark here in contrast with the dark tree, and that's really how we build a lot of depth. And this is really something we can only do in the foreground because it's the only place that has those stark dark colors to apply these stark light colors beside it. So again, it's all about depth. It's all about following the same rules we've been talking about from the start of this painting. And hopefully, at this point, I don't sound just repetitive and boring, but rather things are starting to click. You know, we're seeing how these things are moving together, and we're all getting a better understanding of how this all works together. So here, going back, grabbing more of our burnt umber. This time I'm getting a bit of a darker mixture, and I'm moving inwards towards the tree, which is going to build up more depth. Again, it's about creating different levels of values. This one is a proper medium value between the highlight of the edge of the tree and the dark back of the tree. Again, the back of the tree needs to be the darkest area because the light is on the opposite side. So here we're just going back to the palette and we're essentially doing more of the same. Right now I'm taking a bit of that lighter burnt umber pigment and I'm applying that to our edges. Again, initially we applied it and it was fairly bright, but because acrylic paints dry a little bit darker because they are semi-transparent, that initial light layer that we applied ended up looking a little bit darker 2 to 3 minutes later. So what we need to do is we need to go back and we need to rebuild up those highlights. Very similar to the way that we did so within the water. But it's one of those things where you can get it very bright, you can get it as light as you'd like, but you just need to continuously build up the layer underneath it to be brighter and brighter. That way when it is transparent, that is, when it is a little bit more see-through, you do see what you need to underneath it, right? So it's a light layer on top of a light layer as opposed to a light layer on top of a medium or dark layer. And it's one of those things where in the water, yet again, it's practice. It lets you try things, it lets you see things, and it lets you build up things in a much more natural way. So it's not a bad thing at all. It's definitely more time consuming and it can be an issue in the 10-minute lessons because I'll do something and then by the end of the 10 minutes it'll be dry, it won't be as bright or whatever. But here we really get to take the time and we get to ensure that everything is just the way we want it. So this next couple minutes here, probably 3 to 4 minutes, are all going to be spent predominantly fixing up highlights, adding in additional pieces. And I'm going back and forth between a lot of trees, which is, I think, an important lesson in itself, because we talk about finishing one area, but not actually finishing it because we need to go back. By working on all of these areas at the same time, we ensure that they're all very cohesive because we're using the same pigments. We're probably in a stance, in a mindset, in a rhythm where we're producing a similar type of stroke or application. We're ensuring that, again, it doesn't look all the same, but it looks similar, it looks cohesive, it looks as it should. And that's really the goal there. Now, I would like to note that if you look on the left-hand side of the painting, the trees are a little bit smaller and they have more offshoots, where the trees on the right-hand side, there is that larger piece and there are less offshoots. It's to show you that you don't have to do things one way or the other. You can have a mixture. You can have larger and smaller trees. You can have some that are much more complicated and some that are much more simplified. All of these things are going to grow differently depending upon the irrigation, depending upon the wind, depending upon the animals that live in them, depending upon how old they are. There are so many things to take into consideration when rendering these, and that's why they can be so diverse. With that being said, I'm now going to be adding some additional highlights to our foliage that we had rendered in the foreground. Now that it's dry, I can begin adding in some green, and I added a fairly neutral green on top of the dark pigment. Now I'm going to build a brighter green on top of that. The goal is to add highlight onto highlight onto highlight, keeping some of the midtones in there as well. But we're going to apply this predominantly to the top areas, as we mentioned initially with our first pieces of foliage. That's where the light is going to hit it most. That's where the light's going to be able to pass through the most. It's the least dense area. And we still want the bottom left and right hand corners to be dark enough that they kind of vignette the piece. So we're not adding our starkest highlights here, and we're still letting that dark pigment show through. It's also worth noting that I think when people get towards the foreground, if they aren't really cognizant of the processes of painting, they intend to make them super saturated, super bright, super vibrant. But if everything's that way, nothing really stands out, right? The highlights on these stand out because there's that very dark underlayer beside it. That's what makes things pop out. It's contrast, having something very bright beside something very dark. Again, it's something that generally we only really have the opportunity to do in the foreground, and that's what we're doing right now. We are building that up in the way that we need to. There you could see that I was really getting my brush wet, fixing it up, but then drying it again, because that square-headed brush needs to be dry for our applications. Then I'm going and I'm taking my smaller square-headed brush, and I'm beginning to implement some additional white pieces to the water that we had. Again, it dried, got a little bit darker, got a little bit more transparent, and now we're just building up lighter layers on top of lighter layers. These portions are going to be a little bit more sharp, a little bit more fine, because they are the real peaking areas of the water. They are the areas that are really absorbing a lot of light. They're protruding a lot. So I want them to be sharper, which is why I'm not using the smaller round-headed brush, but instead, again, when you want fine detail, when you want things to be very sharp, I would implore you to use a smaller square-headed brush, and specifically the corner of a small square-headed tripping over my words. Specifically, the corner of the small square-headed brush will get the job done incredibly well. Because of all of the additional bristles, it'll hold it well, you'll be able to hold a lot of paint, and you'll be able to do a really fantastic, clean looking job and rendering in your painting. Now I've let the majority of my painting dry, and we're going to begin doing the colorful, fun foliage. So here I'm grabbing a primary red for the first time. I'm grabbing a bit of titanium white and a very minute amount of our black. I'm doing this again because I want to desaturate the pigment and I want to make it a little bit darker. This will be the foundation layer, this will be the base layer, and we will build highlights and more vibrant pigments on top of this. I'm going to begin applying these clusters of leaves in the same way that we did our bushes. As you can see up here, I'm kind of imagining that there are a litany of different branches moving out in different directions, so I'm not staying directly on the tree. I am moving out. If I do want to add additional branches, I can do that, but I'm also leaving openings within our foliage in our tree here. It's really important that it isn't one large cluster, that it isn't simply a circular shape of this dabbing effect. You want lots of miniature little clusters of foliage here. That's really what's going to make it look interesting. And if you find that they're looking a little bit too similar, try combining shapes. So maybe make the top of a cluster maybe half a circle and the bottom half of it more of a triangular shape. And then maybe you throw a rectangle into the top right-hand corner. But you're doing all of these basic geometric shapes in this dabbing motion. You're doing them in different sizes, which is also vitally important. And you're just ensuring that it's always evolving and changing. Some of these clusters are completely detached from others, and some of them kind of fit together like a maze. You just want to ensure that it is captivating. So here I'm going back, I'm creating a little bit more of that mixture, and I'm not being as precise with creating the exact same color, the exact same pigment, because again, a little bit of variation isn't a bad thing, and when we already have a good amount of pigment on the palette like we did, you can just kind of edit it a little bit, right? You can add to it, you can change it very minorly, and that's what I'm doing. It's also worth noting that I'm not going to be making all of these trees this color. I'm just doing this tree like this, and I'll also do a couple of little complementary bushes and flowers as well in the same color just to balance it out. Generally, when you're painting, you don't want to just incorporate a color in one single area. You might have it in a dominant amount in a dominant area, but then sprinkle it in a couple of other areas just to kind of balance it out. Here you can see that I'm doing that over in our bush to the right. Now I tried applying it, but I had a little bit too much paint, a little bit too much water on my brush, and I needed to get that off. I needed to lessen it. So I wiped that off with my finger. Looked a little bit messy, but that's okay because we can go back in and reapply it. Here, we're applying it to the right-hand side of the painting so that it balances the large amount that we have on the left-hand side of the painting. And we're applying it into the bushes in the same way that we applied the bushes themselves. So it's going to look like a very cohesive flower mixed in with that. And it isn't a pure red, it's much more desaturated, more of a maroon. So it isn't acting as an aggressive complementary color, and it's blending in a little bit more. If we were using a pure red for all of that, it might look like a Christmas painting at this point, and that simply wasn't the intention. So begin with subtlety and then bump up the vibrancy, the color, the saturation, all of that as you go. Here I mixed a bit of a brighter pink, and my hand seems to be in the way. I try really hard to avoid that, and it's awkward because I'm actually painting beside the painting. I'm not standing in front of the painting. I do that so I can put the camera in front of the painting. So angles can get a little bit iffy, but as you can see here, I'm just building up highlighted areas in varying portions of our clusters. These are the areas that are going to be receiving a little bit more reflected light, and they're more the edge of the tree. The middle of the tree is going to be a bit darker because, of course, there's more foliage surrounding it, less light can get towards it, there are more shadows being cast internally on it. So here I'm still just building up additional highlights. I'm picking different areas of our clusters, but I'm still leaving those dark areas in varying areas. You want a good mix of all of them. And now we're almost at the point where you don't see dark and light. You just see this really interesting gradation in this tapping effect. And because the tree's a little bit farther away, this tapping effect obviously implies leaves, which I think look detailed and really pretty here. We can also see some of the branches in between the clusters of leaves, which I think is also very important. Here I'm taking that brighter pigment and I'm adding it back into the flowers and into the bushes that we did initially. We added in the darker pigment, but we didn't add in the lighter pigment. And again, to have it balanced, to have it match, we should probably do a little bit of both as well. So there, I cleaned off my brush. Again, you want that one to be dry. Then I'm taking my smaller square-headed brush. I'm taking some primary blue, taking some primary red, and here you can see that we're mixing more of a purple. It becomes much more apparent as we add some titanium white, and you can choose to make it a warmer purple or a cooler purple depending upon how much red or blue you decide you want to implement in this. But now I'm going to add in some interesting detailed flowers here, as you can see. And these are fairly subtle, as you can see. The value isn't off from the bush. The saturation is also fairly similar. So while it's a different color, it fits very naturally in its setting because the values and the saturations match that of the green bushes. So now I'm adding a couple more into the more middle ground, and they're a little bit larger because they're a little bit closer to us. I decided to add them to both sides of the painting, again, to instigate more balance. I'm going back to my palette, I'm building up more of a highlighted version of it, and then I'm beginning to add that to our foliage as well. Again, just like everything else, I'm starting with a more neutral, darker pigment, and then I add the highlights on top. I'm also throwing a couple of those highlights into the pinks as well, just to give it a little bit more cohesive coloring, I guess. So the painting's really coming along, and I'm very happy with it, but I think it still needs a good amount of color. And so now we'll get some primary yellow, we'll get some primary red, these two mixed together to make an orange. Then we'll make it a bit brighter with our titanium white, and I'll begin to instigate or incorporate a couple of additional flowers in the background. Because they are in the background, they need to be a little bit more subtle, and they can't be as vibrant or saturated. So that's what we're doing there. It's also worth noting, if you're applying these types of flowers on top of your painting and the colors aren't coming across right, again, it's because acrylic paints dry semi-transparently and semi-dark. So you might not get those more saturated or more natural pigments that you want initially. Again, it's a good thing. But if you want to thicken your pigment, you can use more titanium white. And titanium white is actually a very thick acrylic pigment, whereas pigments like primary yellow, primary blue, primary red, they're much more thin, they're much more transparent, they're much more see-through. So if you want to cover up something that's very dark, or at least get a new brighter base on it, I'd implore you to use more white in your mixture, which will obviously desaturate it, but once that's dry, you can apply the more saturated color on top of it, and you'll get a very light, heavily saturated color, which is great for the real foreground. It's just a quicker way to build up those layers and get to those light saturated pigments much more quickly. One color that can have a real issue with that, if you're just trying to build it up without the white, is orange. If you're applying an orange over a black without any titanium white, it'll look incredibly dark, like maybe even 5 layers in. And because the yellow is very heavy in orange, the yellow and the black underneath can kind of mix together. Not literally mix, but just optically, because one's sitting on top of the other and you can see one through the other, it'll look a little bit green. So that's an issue, and that's something I see a lot of beginners make the mistake with. Sometimes I make the mistake with it, actually. But again, if you're working with orange over black, I'd implore you to use a lot of white in your initial mixture, and then from there, add in the more saturated orange color on top after the lighter titanium white heavy layer has dried. I hope that makes sense. I know it's a bit of a complicated process there, but we'll talk about it more in our nighttime hour-long painting lessons in the future, and how different colors kind of react and work together as they are placed on top of one another. So from there, I added some additional yellow pieces in there, and I just want to diversify my colors. None of them are super saturated, none of them are super vibrant. They're kind of spaced out and balanced appropriately, and I'm still just continuing to follow the rules that we did initially in our painting. Here, however, I am going to begin working on another tree in our foreground. So again, how do we start this? We start it with a darker, desaturated version of our color, which is what I'm doing here. This tree is going to be more of a blue-violet pigment, and so I'm beginning with a very desaturated blue-violet. Then I'm taking that same pigment, I'm applying it to 2 or so other portions of our painting, just ensuring that that color isn't only in a single area. And then I'm going to let it dry a little bit, as you can see, and we'll go back in and add more highlights to it. But I do kind of want to build it out a little bit more. So here, we'll remix a little bit more of that color. You see me get that blue, I'll get that red. We have the darker version of it, as you can see. Now we need to brighten it up a little bit, desaturate it, mute it, and I'm adding the additional red in there to warm it up. So we have the initial color that we used right above it, so we have something to kind of reference, as we talked about before, and that's what's great about working with a large palette and not always cleaning off your palette as you're working. Having those pieces around to reference, to go back to, can be incredibly helpful and vital in the painting process. Now here you can see that I'm throwing in a little bit of blue in the bottom right hand corner and just moving it about. So I know that's probably getting a little bit repetitive, but it's so important that you don't forget, if you use a stark different color, you don't forget to incorporate it in at least one more area. Generally, preferably, you want to do a color in 3 areas of a painting, 3 or 5. If you do 2, you can kind of balance it or split paintings in half. So it's something I forget occasionally. It's something a lot of people would forget. It's can be a little bit difficult to do, but if you use a stark color, try to incorporate it in, say, 3 areas, 1 dominant. So if I have it dominantly on the tree, then I'll add it in 2 other bushes, or I'll add it in 4 other bushes, which makes a total of 5, right? So trying to keep it on an odd number just so we don't break the painting in half, kind of, and so everything feels a little bit more balanced. But here I'm adding in the highlights to that tree, as you can see. We're using a little bit more of our titanium white, which desaturates it, so we use a little bit more color, and we'll just go through that trial and error process that we've been doing from the start here. Now, as you can see, we've used a new paper towel, a new cloth through this whole lesson. I forgot to mention that earlier, but if you find that your cloth is getting a little bit too damp, if you find that you're not getting clean areas, if you're going back to wipe off paint on your paper towel or your cloth and you're picking up new paint, that's an issue. That is something you need to swap out and change. It's very much akin to when your water is dirty and you want to mix with a new color and then they kind of mix together. That can also be a really big issue with yellow, actually, because if your water is very black or if it has blue or green in it and you're using a pure yellow, you dip your brush into that, you get that black or that blue on your brush, just the water, and then it mixes with the yellow and then you get much more of a dirty pigment. Just something to look out for. Yellow is a very delicate color, and I'd implore you to treat it with a lot of respect and attention. So here I've moved over to my smaller round-headed brush. Again, this is great for detail, but also kind of more of a feathered detail. So here I'm adding in a couple of additional little pieces into our tree, a couple of additional little pieces into our flowers or foliage and all of that. And I'm doing this just so I have a little bit more control of where these things are, because when we use the old square-headed brush, it has such a random application, which is great because obviously it ensures that things are always evolving and changing as they need to be. But if you want to work very specifically, very directionally, if you want something to lead the eye, then that's when you want to break out either the corner of the small square-headed brush or the small round-headed brush to implement a little bit of additional, more controlled detail, something that you can be a little bit more pragmatic with, rather than the more cathartic nature of the older square-headed brush. Now here I'm throwing some additional little yellow pieces over into the left-hand corner of the painting, and I'm doing that because if you look at it, the yellow is almost absent from the painting at this point, right? With the exclusion of the bottom right-hand corner. We needed to ensure that we could reincorporate it back into other areas to balance it as we should. So here you can see that I'm actually doing a lot with it. I really do like the yellow in conjunction with everything else in the painting, and I think that it's actually really aiding it. Because yellow, it's analogous, or it's very close on the color palette to our greens, and it'll work very, very cohesively. Now, speaking of greens, I'm going to do a green tree in the top right-hand corner. So I'm mixing a very dark pigment for our initial underlayer for our foliage, and I'm applying that in that dabbing motion that you know oh so well. Now, because it has a good amount of black in it, it's going to look very reflective at first. And this is an issue a lot of people I find can have when they're initially using a lot of black heavy pigments, because it's very deceiving, right? It looks a lot brighter than it is. You can't really tell what the color is naturally. It's one of those things where you mix it on your palette and you trust yourself, because when it dries, it will be the color you need. You'll be able to see it properly. But in the meantime, it'll be a little bit too reflective. It'll look a lot brighter than it is. It'll be a little bit more confusing. So if you find that's an issue, I would implore you to mix that pigment on the palette first and then move it over to your actual painting, and just have faith that when it dries, it will look the way you want it to. It's a process, and it's something that, again, acrylic paint's very, very forgiving. You can go back, you can change it, you can edit it, you can do great things with it. So don't worry about that. From there, I'm going to begin taking a bit of titanium white and creating a bit of a brighter mixture for this tree. Again, we layer down the foundation, then we add in the highlights. And that's what I'm doing. I'm going to use a little bit more of a yellow mixture here just to give it a bit more saturation, because if we were to just add a white to our darker mixture, it would get brighter, but it would also get less saturated. So to balance it out, I'm adding the titanium white and I'm adding the primary yellow, and the two together will make this much more bright, vibrant green. I'm adding it to the outskirts of our foliage clusters, and on top certain areas that will be protruding. Again, any area that will really be touching a good amount of light. That's really the key to rendering depth with any subject within your painting. It's, again, so wonderful how everything really follows this very similar set of rules. And there aren't really that many of them, but they can be a little bit complicated at first. But once you get them, again, painting from then on out, it's just a much more easy, much more relaxed, much more cathartic process that comes much more innately, right? You don't have to think about it as much. So here I'm going in and I'm incorporating additional little branches. I'm using my smaller square-headed brush because it's very sharp and because it has that nice fine-tipped edge and corner for rendering real details. I'm working in between different clusters of foliage. Occasionally I'm going on top of them. Occasionally I'm making it look like it's going behind them. You want to do both in this process to ensure that it looks proper. And then of course I'm connecting it back to our tree, as you can see there. I don't want to do too many branches because I don't want to overcomplicate that area. I don't want those areas to kind of take our vision and keep them and hold them. I want it to be a little bit more fluid. But we're just adding in enough that it feels a little bit more balanced and proper. So I'm not just doing that with the green tree, I'm also moving over to the left-hand side of the painting, and I'm doing that over there as well. Remember, branches should overlap, they should not be straight, they should have kind of jagged, squiggly edges as well, and they need to progressively get smaller and smaller as they move upwards. Occasionally, branches, I didn't do it in this one, but it's something to keep in the back of your head. They can move back downwards, right? They don't always have to be moving upwards. So if the tree is the main focal point in your painting and you really want to incorporate a lot of detail into it, don't just have the branches expand upwards on a 45-degree angle and then a 33-degree angle and then a 73-degree angle. Maybe move them back downwards occasionally as well. It'll make it a lot more interesting and it'll make it look a lot more real, because branches have weight and that drags them down, and they have bends in them, and they don't always just grow straight up. They are always evolving, always changing, as we always talk about. So we're really coming here to the end of the painting, and I really like what we did here today. I'm really proud of it. I hope that as you complete it, you are also incredibly proud of what you did. It's a good thing that we're ending the video fairly soon, because I don't know if you've noticed, I'm tripping more and more and more on my words. I guess that's just what happens when you sit in your room all day and make art. So thank you for putting up with me for my speech and all of this through this lesson. I hope that you really feel like you've learned at least something, that you've had some fun, that you feel a little bit more confident about going out and completing this painting now. And again, if you've finished this, if you've worked on it and you'd like to share it with me, please do so. Please send it to me. Eventually, I would like to post some of them over on the Facebook page. Let me know what you'd like to see in future hour-long lessons. These are really, they're so much fun to do because we can do so much more in them. We get to elaborate and do much more complex, interesting paintings. So I hope you've been enjoying the hour-long painting series. I look forward to seeing you in next month's renditions as well. P.S. Do people say P.S. in real life? I don't know if that's a thing. But I do really want to thank you for supporting me here on Patreon, for supporting the channel. Because of you, I get to spend as much time as I do painting, creating these things, and sharing these ideas with you. I think it's so important that in a very digital age that we keep art alive in this traditional medium, because it's so beautiful, it carries so much history, and it's just wonderful for me to be able to share this with you and know that we are collectively ensuring that this is something that lives on. So again, thank you for supporting me, thank you for supporting for the channel, and thank you for supporting art in general. You have a lovely day.